50 years ago, the U-2 plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars recently convened a panel to reassess the spy plane's role in Cold War history. The following portion discusses the operation of the U-2 plane. It's 25 minutes.
Thank you all for coming. As part of our seminar on Mayday 1960, Reassessing the U-2 shoot-down, we're very pleased and very lucky to have Charles P. Wilson II here giving us a presentation on U-2 operations. Charles Wilson is a senior manager for airborne intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, ISR systems at Raytheon Systems Corporation. Prior to joining Raytheon, Wilson completed a distinguished Air Force career, serving as a U-2 pilot and a U-2 instructor pilot. Wilson has also held key positions within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, and the Department of State. A rated Air Force command pilot, Wilson has commanded 2 U-2 squadrons. The 4402 Reconnaissance Group Squad in Taif, Saudi Arabia, and also the 5th Reconnaissance Squadron based on Osan Air Base, South Korea. He is a graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, the Air Force College, and was in 1997 a National Defense Fellow. He is also the recipient of the State Department's Distinguished Superior Honor Award for Leadership. Mr. Wilson, the floor is yours. Right after the presentation, I'm gonna do an introduction for the panel, and we're gonna start the conference.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here and talk about one of the loves of my life, and that's the U-2. I was very privileged, and I got to live a dream, and that was to be able to pilot this machine. It's a fantastic machine. And when the Woodrow Wilson Center contacted me, they asked me to share with you just some of the way that what goes into a mission. And what I thought of is I'd bring a few pictures along, and this set of pictures is from a briefing that was developed in the mid-1980s for General Jack Chane, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Command. And at that time, he wanted to do things to attract and enhance the image of the Strategic Air Command, so we had the air crews develop briefings. Here we're at the U-2 squadrons, and you'll recognize one of the young pilots in this briefing. We were constrained because most of the things that we did in the U-2 was classified. And so we thought, well, what can we present for General Chane? And he was going to use this for to show at pilot training bases for the student pilots and the instructor pilots, national civic groups, Rotary clubs, and so forth. And so we thought it would be a good idea to put together a series of slides on a life or day in the life of a U-2 pilot getting ready for a mission and flying that mission. And this briefing, interestingly enough, over the years got lost. It was rediscovered around November of '08. And when I saw it in my storehouse on 35mm carousel, I thought, gosh, is that briefing? And second of all, when I went to look for a 35mm projector, I found it very difficult. Amen. So that was a job to convert it to the slide. So the U-2 is not your father's Oldsmobile. This magnificent machine is not, the program is 55 years old, but the machine is much younger. The last ones rolled off the assembly line, and I think we received it in the Air Force of October of 1989. The fleet is relatively young, and Lockheed has forecasted it could last a few more decades. And they've been re-engined, they've got glass cockpits, and they are very, very active today. Do you want me to scroll my own slides? The briefing, I'll share with you a little bit of the history. I won't spend a lot of time on history because we're going to get a lot of that this afternoon. I'll inform you of the mission that we had back in those days, and it's slightly changed a little bit because it's become more tactical in nature. And I'm really going to spend a lot of time just going through what it's like to get ready for and fly a high-altitude U-2 mission. This was our mission. We were, wherever there was a hot spot around the world, you would probably find several of us. We got our tasking from the highest authorities through a very elaborate process. A typical high flight, what we do is we prepare the mission preparation. What you're going to see is a suit up, some of the launches, mission execution, and how we recover the aircraft. Getting ready, really the day before, we watch our diets. U-2 pilots generally take in a significant amount of protein because of the pressure differentials that we experience at altitude. The day of the flight, 2 hours and 15 minutes prior, we went and got breakfast, and it was generally steak and eggs. High protein, low in residue. After breakfast, we'd go over and we'd get our intelligence briefings. We'd get the weather briefings for the area that we were going to go into. And you'll notice that there are two pilots. You know, there's a mission pilot that's identified, and then there's a backup pilot who I'll call the mobile officer. The reason for those two pilots is in the event that the pilot comes down sick, he gets a cold or something like that, the backup pilot can fill in. After the intelligence and weather briefings, the mission pilot goes in and gets a complete physical. Don't want to send a pilot somewhere where he might come down sick. Missions can be long, and he might be in an area of very sensitive operations, and so we want to make sure that he's in top physical shape. So he gets a complete physical before. And while that's happening, the backup pilot goes out and he starts pre-flight in the airplane, and I'll talk to that in a little bit. Right after the physical, the mission pilot goes and suits up in a full pressure suit. The suits that we used are much like the astronauts use. In fact, in the early days of the shuttle program, the astronauts used some of our suits. But why do we use a pressure suit? Well, two reasons. One is Boyle's law. Robert Boyle, several hundred years ago, discovered that a given property of gas varies, actually, it's inversely proportional to the amount of pressure that's put upon it. And we are human beings down below an ocean of air, and this air has weight. And the pressure that exerts upon us is 14.7 pounds per square inch. And up at altitude, the pressure is less than a half a pound. That combined with Armstrong's line is where, at 63,000 feet, conventional liquids boil at 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you combine the two, a rapid decompression at altitude, well, our bodies would burst, and the 98-degree part, yeah, they'd boil. It'd ruin our whole day, in other words. And we can't have that. We've got to succeed with our mission. Getting back to the suit up, a couple of technicians from the Physiological Support Division, they help us get the suit on. There's a lot. You have to crawl in through the back. There's a lot of fasteners, a lot of zippers, straps. They button us up. We put a helmet on, and they test us. The first thing we get checked, of course, for is making sure that we get the oxygen, because we're completely sealed. Now, one of the things I didn't think of before I became a U-2 pilot was, what if my nose itches? Well, I found out that I just can't reach in and grab and scratch my nose. I had to be very innovative. We also go through communications checks, and once that's set up, the mission pilot goes and he sits for at least 60 minutes pre-breathing 100% oxygen before takeoff. Why? Well, I know you've all heard of the bends. Climbing up high, if you have nitrogen, a significant amount of nitrogen in your bloodstream, it could cause the bends. And so pre-breathing 100% oxygen for 60 minutes gets about 99% of the nitrogen out of the bloodstream. You know, we don't want any of those bubbles to form up and float around through our veins to a vital area, and you know, ultimately it could cause us catastrophe, pain on one side and death at the worst. Meanwhile, during that hour, our backup pilot or our mobile officer goes out and pre-flights the airplane. Most airplanes, the pilot does his own pre-flight. But with this airplane, the backup pilot does it, and he rings it out. He gets in the cockpit. He makes sure all the switches are in the right position. Because you can imagine if you're wearing a spacesuit, you lose a little bit of dexterity. Your visibility tends to diminish a little bit. And so that pilot needs all the help he can get. But he's still supposed to be able to do it all by himself. When he's ready to go, he's transported out to the aircraft. This is poor technique here. You know, he's carrying his own oxygen pack. But the pilot gets into the cockpit, and as you can see, the technicians have to really reach in because all of the cables, and there are 3 or 4, the oxygen line, and we have stirrups. You didn't expect that, which are attached to reels in the seat. So our spurs on our boots connect to cables which go into the seat in the event that we need to eject. All of these connections have to be made, and they're done by physiological support. Meanwhile, the pilot, once that's done, he's got to go through his checklist. In the day, we couldn't show this cockpit. But as you can see, the cockpit of the U-2 is quite a nice cockpit. Kind of small, but it's very nice. And you can see the checklist on the pilot's legs. He's got quite a few things that he has to go through before he can even taxi the airplane. Now, taxiing the airplane. Not many people really think about the difficulty in taxiing an airplane. Well, the U-2, I must say, there isn't a whole lot that's easy about it, and that's why the pilots love it, because it's so hard. Taxiing the airplane, we have a tail gear steering, and the tail gear can move 6.5 degrees left to right of center. And what that means is turning into the wind, the turn radius is going to be about 189 feet. Turning away from the wind, taxiing turn radius is going to be over 300 feet. Not all ways accommodate our taxi. Some runways, we have to pre-position the U-2 at the threshold of the runway before loading the pilot in. So it's an interesting thing to taxi that airplane. Getting ready for takeoff. Once the pilot gets the takeoff clearance, and you'll notice that there are 2 outrigger gear on the aircraft, those outrigger gear fall off as soon as the wings start generating lift. Once the pilot is cleared for takeoff, the climb out is pretty impressive. You can see one of the pogos have fallen off, but I'll show you another slide here. As soon as the wings start generating lift, the pogo will fall off. And the aircraft to climb out at 14,000, 15,000 feet per minute. And I must say, the first time I sat in a U-2 at that climb rate, I fixated on the altimeter. And that's the wrong thing for a pilot to do. And keep in mind, when we hire U-2 pilots, they generally have about 1,500 or more hours in multiple airplanes, so they're not new pilots. So when I fixated on that altimeter, that impressed me. And here's another shot of the climb out from the cockpit. It's pretty impressive. Once we get up to altitude, we have to set up our mission, and we run our mission equipment. At this part of that briefing, I really couldn't go into a lot of the things that we did on our mission or the areas that we went to because of the sensitivities, but you are going to get into a lot of that here this afternoon, so I won't dwell on that. The pilot goes through, he runs the mission, and then I'll give you a couple of photographs that we were allowed to see. But before, in some of the earlier cockpits, there is a view sight. And this is a pretty handy device to have, and at the altitudes that we fly at, and that's above 70,000 feet, the first bit of ground that we pick up from the edge of our canopy could be, 65, 70 miles away. So it's kind of handy to be able to look directly below and to, see the ground track, if you will. Can't do that all the time because occasionally there's cloud cover. Here's a picture from altitude. I added a few. There's 5 pictures from later years that we couldn't have from before. It's a great view. It's a beautiful view. It's a colorful view. And what you're seeing here is that body of water is Lake Tahoe, and you can see the U-2 wing off to the right of the picture. It's a magnificent view. Here's a couple of shots. They're degraded a little bit of San Francisco because of the projection that the image had to go through. But if our image analysts could blow it up 40 times or so, and this is back from the SAC days, they could take their magnifying glasses out and they can peek in windows and see things like that and do quite a bit of analysis. After the mission, the pilot has to prepare for descent. How long do you think it takes a U-2 to come down from altitude? The airplane is aerodynamically clean. It likes to fly. About 35 to 40 minutes using normal procedures. And that's with the gear down, and the tires aren't filled with air. They're filled with nitrogen. With the gear down, the speed breaks out, and a slight turn. It's going to take a while to get down from altitude. So that pilot has to plan that out, when he's going to descend and what he's going to do during the descent. And in the meantime, that mobile officer is going to be out in his, at the time it was a Mustang, but right now they've been using Z28 Camaros. And since they no longer made Z28s, they've had to transition, I think, to Pontiacs. Here's an airplane. There's the U-2 coming in for a landing right now. Here's the Mustang that I was talking about. The interesting thing about this Mustang, we got the idea from the California Highway Patrol. Back in the day, we had chips come out, and they were using Ford Mustangs, the high-performance Mustangs, and we liked the way they perform, and we started using those Mustangs, and they served us very well. Now, the pilot of the Mustang still has to get checked out. He's not only checked out in the airplane, he's got to be checked out in the car. And in the Air Force, we used to have these things called Form 8s. And the Form 8s would be cut only, you would think, for an airplane checkout. Well, I can't think of another program where you would have a Form 8 cut on the handling of a vehicle. Well, you'd find that in the U-2 program. And so that pilot is chasing that vehicle down, and he's the margin of safety. That's why he's there. He's going to chase it down. He might be 80, 90, 100, 110 miles an hour or more, and he's going to be that pilot's extra set of eyes, and he's going to call out altitudes from about 10 feet, and he's going to call out speed deviations if there are, because right now is a critical phase of flight. And for the U-2, it's very critical because the airplane almost has to be stalled to land. Now, by stalling, I don't mean putting on the brakes. By stalling, I mean to cause the wings to stop generating lift. And that is done with precise airspeed control. And that's why we hire the best pilots we can. And so they're he's chasing the airplane down the runway. And you can see the pilot is approaching 2 feet here. He's slightly hot, and the way I can tell that is his tail gear is up a little higher than the main gear. But he's going to slow to stall speed, and he's going to drop it in from about 2 foot. Now, keep in mind this pilot might have been up over 9 hours. He's lost about 4.5 pounds or more in water weight through perspiration, dehydration, physical effort, and he has to wrestle this airplane to the ground. And he's doing it in a spacesuit. And this is the view he'd have. Think about that. Here's an airplane that's on speed at 2 feet. Now you would think once you're on the ground, that's it. This airplane likes to fly on those wings if the fuel is balanced, because they're wet wings. That pilot's going to fly these wings to down 10 to 15 knots. but all the way he's got tandem gear, bicycle gear, so he's got to do a balancing act all the way until he stops. He'll drop the airplane off on a titanium skid. There are skids on each wingtip. The ground crews will come out, put the pogos in, and he'll taxi to park. And that pretty much ends a typical day of a U-2 pilot. Sir?
What year was this presentation originally made?
1986. There were 5 slides added from later years. The model right here is the R model. And right now they're flying the S model. I had the privilege of taking the S model operational myself at Osan Air Base, Korea. And that was October 12th of 1995.
First time I ever looked in the cockpit, I had to laugh because the plywood floor and strap iron seat.
Yes, and they didn't have,
1960.
well, the way that they would raise and lower the seat is with wooden boxes. They would be about 3 inches. I flew one of those old models when I was getting interview flights, and I must say, to adjust the seat height, it wasn't a switch. They would have these boxes, and you'd set them on, stack them on top of one another.
Let me just ask you to just hold on to get a mic before you ask your question. So first, right there.
If you can say, what's the clean glide ratio?
Can't really say here, but it's probably about 10 times more than your typical airplane. I won't compare it to a glider, though.
Okay, you said that the day was pretty well ended when you landed, but there's always post-flight debriefs, and of course you've got to get back on normal oxygen. How much more time is involved before you're free to go home after landing? After landing,
Well, provided everything came, I shouldn't say came out all right, because every once in a while there's an accident that happens. And that happens from being sick, or if someone comes down with the flu. The pressure differential, you could imagine if you're eating the wrong types of food with the different, the pressures, you know, the expansion in the gastrointestinal tracts, if there's an accident, it might take a while to get out of the suit. Pilot usually has to do it himself rather than get help. But we're usually around for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending upon the length of the intelligence debrief if we're overseas.
Okay. Well, let's take a couple of minutes break, and then we'll start with the first panel. So in the meantime, there's some refreshments outside. Thank you, Colonel Wilson, for a wonderful presentation.
You're one of the millions who enjoy our 16th president. You'll find a contemporary perspective in C-SPAN's book, Abraham Lincoln, now in paperback at your favorite bookseller. Learn more at cspan.org/Lincoln Book. You're watching a